Hello, this is the follow-up to the first video that I made concerning making a murderer. The first one was perhaps a little bit too long and rambling in places, so I'm going to try and streamline this version, cut it down, and to that end I've decided to focus on just one aspect of the case, what I would refer to as the villains of the piece. Now, given the nature of the actual series, you might be forgiven for thinking that the villains of the piece are the two defendants, Steven Avery and Brendan Dassey. But when you actually come to watch the programme, it soon becomes apparent that they are not the villains of the piece. The real villains, the real antagonists, are members of the judiciary and the members of the local law enforcement agency. So the first person that I want to speak about is the chief prosecution lawyer, who is called Ken Kratz. Now, Kratz is an individual with very few redeeming qualities, and even the name itself has an aggressive, harsh sound to it. And the way that the man speaks is equally annoying. He has this high-pitched, whiny tone to his speech that never fails to annoy me. Now, one of his low points during the actual court case, and there were several, included the way that he described the appearance of Steven Avery. When Brendan goes over to see his uncle, he keeps describing him in really gross terms as, you know, him being drenched in sweat, this sweaty person standing at the door. But perhaps the lowest point in Ken Kratz's legal career is when he actually was part of a dreadful stage-managed event. And this was the press conference that was given, where details, supposed details, of the murder of the young woman, Teresa Halbach, were relayed to the public. Now, of course, this information was all as a result of Brendan Dassey's supposed confession. And you could see Ken Kratz revelling in it, being in the limelight in this way. And also the sanctimonious nature where, for example, he said to the audience, if there's anybody under the age of 16, you need to leave the room now because of the nature of the kind of information that was about to be disclosed. It was dreadful stuff, it really was. Now, Kratz makes a few appearances in season 2 because he's the sort of guy that whenever there's an opportunity to be in front of the cameras, he'll be there. And also there is another side issue. He's trying to flog copies of his book about the trial. What is amusing, and again, there's another German element to this, because in the interim, Kratz has actually been accused of what's called sexting. In other words, sending sexually explicit texts to clients of his, female clients of his, bragging about his sexual potency and the like. And as a result of that, he actually resigned from his post. Oh, how I love that concept, that German concept of Schadenfreude, delight in somebody else's misfortune. How appropriate that is in the case of Mr. Kratz. Okay, so that's Kratz out of the way. When it comes to season 2, Kathleen Zellner has established what she would regard as 3 persons of interest. And for anybody who has watched season 1, if you're smart, you really should have noticed these three people as you were watching that series and thought to yourself, these guys should definitely have been considered as possible contenders by the police, and why weren't they? So the first person to mention in that regard is the murdered woman's former boyfriend, who's called Ryan Hillegas. Now, as I've said in the first video, he's a really shady sort of character, and I can't pronounce upon him. I can't say for certain, oh yes, this guy is a definite suspect. But what I can say is that, given the fact that there are elements of his lifestyle that I'm not familiar with, I can only go on what I know so far in terms of what the series has revealed to me. So that there are allegations, apparently, I don't know how credible these are, that the young woman was in an abusive relationship with him. It certainly does seem as if he is a sort of controlling kind of figure. And there are elements in terms of season 2 that have since emerged which show that he knows more than he's letting on about. It does seem highly suspicious that he has this day book which the young woman carried about with her, with all her appointments included in it. The fact that it's in his possession just seems highly suspicious. And then there is, of course, his relationship with the young woman's brother, Mike Hallback. There's a particular interview which you can see in season 1, where the two of them are being questioned about their role in terms of looking for the woman, looking for the car. And during that particular interview, Mike Hallback is sort of jumping around as if he's got ants in his pants. It's one of those interviews. It's like two kids who are just being interviewed after a window's been broken by a football, and they're trying to deny any involvement in it whatsoever. You just know these two guys are not telling the truth, just by their body language, the way that they're trying to reassure each other and to finish each other's sentences. Something intensely suspicious about those two. But anyway, in terms of Hillegas, we know that he went into his ex-girlfriend's phone records. He managed to guess her password and her account name. I mean, all of this seems highly unethical and very, very suspicious behaviour, because it also seems likely that he deleted messages on her phone. Again, I mean, this guy just he strikes us as a wrong 'un when you look at his behaviour. Now, of course, as I said, I can't speak with any degree of sureness about this, because there are elements of his lifestyle that I know nothing about. If he was to be a real suspect in this case, you would need to investigate things like, for example, his work. I don't know if it would be possible for him to have committed the crime. Was he working that day? What work did he do? What sort of car did he have? Did he drive? Where does he live? What sort of living arrangements are there? Does he live on his own? Does he live with a lodger or what? I don't know. So those are elements that I would need more details about. But certainly in terms of the way that he behaved during the actual court case itself, there was almost a flicker of arrogance and of smirking on his face at times when he was being asked questions by the defence team. And you could see him almost blowing off those questions, almost arrogantly, almost implying, why are you asking me such questions? So, in other words, there's a lot to this guy, a lot more to this guy than meets the eye, and he definitely should have been a suspect. And yet, as far as we are aware, the police never treated him as such. So the other two persons of interest that I need to mention here are the two figures of Bobby Dassey, who is Brendan's brother, and Scott Tadych, who's married to Barb Janda, who's Stephen Avery's sister. Now, those two are particularly interesting because they supply alibis for each other. But perhaps the most interesting thing to emerge in season 2, and this is something that came out on the internet prior to that, so we did know this already, is that a computer that Bobby Dassey was using contains a huge amount of pornographic material and searches for pornographic material, some of it involving death and strangulation of young females, that sort of material. Pretty hardcore stuff. And one wonders in that respect, well, why didn't the police prosecute him for this material? And why did he then come up with such helpful statements which corroborated the police version of events? You could, of course, argue that pressure was put on him to say the things that he said, and basically avoid any suspicion, because otherwise the police would have said to him, look, if you don't say this, we'll make public what's on your computer and we'll investigate you from that point of view. So those two figures are really interesting because, as I say, they both offered alibis that basically were corroborating each other's stories. And there's an interesting moment in season 2 where one of them, at least, I think it's Scott Tadych, is on the phone to Stephen Avery in prison while Barb Janda is speaking to him, and he's absolutely going ballistic when he finds out that Kathleen Zellner is asking about him and is considering him as a person of interest. You can see he's not pleased about that at all. But as Stephen Avery points out, trying to play it coolly on the phone, you know, if that's the direction that her investigation is leading her in, then that's the way it will go. The other thing I should say about the boyfriend, Ryan Hillegas, is that Kathleen Zellner did invite him, or did ask if she could ask him questions about the affair, and he will not collaborate, will not cooperate with her whatsoever. Again, that's very interesting, isn't it? If he was completely innocent, he'd have nothing to hide, and he'd be quite willing to cooperate with Zellner, but he's refused to cooperate with her at all. Very telling indeed. So those are the three figures that I wanted to speak about as persons of interest. So we've got, on the one hand, the former boyfriend, Ryan Hillegas, and then we've got possibly two people involved together, namely the figures of Bobby Dassey, and there's also Scott Tadych. And those three certainly are worth investigating, and I'm sure that more material will emerge in future about those three individuals who should have been at least suspects in the case. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this, and you never know, there might be a part 3.